One job left to do.
Okay, well, as you know, it went to a judge's decision, and that decision was unanimous.
Oh, why doesn't anyone rewind the fucking tape?
On the 20th of August, 1994, Marc Thorpe, a former employee at Lucasfilm, held an event at the Fort Mason Center in San Francisco that, unbeknownst to him, would create a domino effect that would get many people across the world to pursue a career in robotics, create a sport that holds competitions of different kinds every year, and create a UK cult television program that still has a passionate and knowledgeable fan base nearly 24 years after its initial airing. This is the story of a community that, even despite multiple setbacks, still has its dedicated group of fanatics to this very day. This is the story of triumphs, downfalls, safety violations, lawsuits, and the most ridiculous controversies you'll have ever heard of. This is the history of Robot Wars. While Marc Thorpe is often credited as the originator of robot fighting as a sport, the first ever radio-controlled fighting competition was held back in 1987 during that year's Mile High Con in Denver, Colorado. The competition was named Critter Crunch and was the brainchild of Bill Wellen, a member of the Denver Mad Scientists Society, a remote control and robotics club. The competition came after a previous version of the competition called Critter Crawl, where radio-controlled robots raced each other. According to the 1997 edition of the rules, the dimensions of the robot were limited to 12 by 12 by 12 inches, and the robots in Class A had to be no heavier than 20 pounds, or approximately 9 kilos, and 2.5 pounds in Class B. Some potential entrants are discussing kit is capable of significant mayhem, so don't get too attached to your entry, the pre-convention mailing told congoers back in 1987, almost acting as a precursor to the regular use of terms like mechanical mayhem, which became synonymous with the show we all know and love. And even more surprising than that, in 1991, there was another robot competition held, yet by another member of the Denver Mad Scientists Society. This time held in Atlanta's DragonCon, and the brainchild of Kelly Lockhart, a managing editor for a weekly newspaper and a consulting editor for a science fiction book publisher. Despite the earliness of the competition and possible run-ins with COVID in more recent years, it's still running today, recently having its 2021 competition last Labor Day. Marc Thorpe's conception of Robot Wars came at his time as an employer for Industrial Light and Magic, the special effects company at Lucasfilm. He was originally a chief model maker and animatronic designer for Star Wars and Indiana Jones. However, the 50-hour-a-week working schedule would take a toll on Thorpe, and in the latter years of his time there, he moved into the career of making toys for Lucas Toys, which at the time was a brand new division of the company. Unfortunately, his health was starting to struggle, and in 1993, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease at the age of 46. This left Thorpe with a troubling prospect, and with Lucas closing Lucas Toys later that year, he was staring at what could have been the end of his career. With the looming danger of his financial security being threatened, he needed to do something quickly. Marc was a politically left-leaning performance artist who attended California State University in the 1970s, and at one point during his teenage years wrote a letter to then California Governor Ronald Reagan calling him a fascist. He also raised crocodiles with his family, in case you needed to know about that. His performance art would lead him into teaching dolphins to swim in synchronized patterns. He and his wife Denise took out a 16mm film camera and filmed one of these performances, and it would air on both HBO and Nickelodeon in 1976. The short film was titled Betty and Eva, after the two dolphins who he trained. The project itself was a great outlet for creativity for Thorpe, but not much in the way of money would come out of it. What he didn't have in business know-how, he more than made up for in creativity. And, to be financially stable, he needed to find a career in something that would make the most out of his creative side. This led to him getting the job at Industrial Light and Magic. Fast forward to the early 1990s, and this once stable career was hanging in the balance. He needed to be able to support his family in case he became too ill to work. One day, he was tinkering around with the concept of radio-controlled vacuum cleaners, with the idea of turning a mundane chore into something that could be fun. He built a tank with 4 wheels and a handheld vacuum cleaner mounted to the front.
And in this corner, mini fridge.
Needless to say, it didn't work, but making that tankume cleaner had planted an idea into his head. As I looked at it, the 8-year-old boy in me envisioned its potential as a dangerous toy with battery-powered tools mounted to it. I had a vision of it cutting its way through a wall. That reminded me of my fighting vehicle toy concept. He pitched the idea of a destructive vehicles-themed toy line for Mattel, which he titled Danger Zone. He was swiftly turned down, with them replying with, "Somebody's going to figure out how to do this." Thorpe took the vacuum cleaner off the radio-controlled tank and put weapons on instead, and that became the light bulb moment. The only thing needed was a name. Robot Wars. Once I had the idea, I set about finding ways to make a visual representation, and I filled a trademark application. My biggest fear was that the trademark, the brand would not be recognised due to conceptual stretch implied in the name. How do you define what a robot is or not? I did not know if people would accept the characterization of what are essentially RC vehicles as robots. As it is, no one had challenged RW as misleading. I feel that people want this so much that they disregard the issue. So I started to modify my tank, putting scary, sinister-looking devices, etc. onto it. Literally just putting them onto it. None of them worked, it was all for show. Next, I took photos, created rules, and advertised. I took out ads in an art magazine and an RC magazine. I was not prepared for what was about to happen. It wasn't without its problems, though. Mark had thought of the idea back in 1992, but there was a 2-year period of premature starts. He would reserve and cancel potential venue locations due to not having enough money to put down a deposit. And the ads that he put out in Art Week, a West Coast magazine, wasn't bringing much attention either. By 1993, he was starting to worry that it was going to be finished before it had already started. This would continue until he sent a promotional package to Wired magazine, and a few days later, the magazine contacted him back, stating that they wanted to produce photographs for an article on the inaugural Robot Wars competition. But the promotional robots that Thorpe made didn't work. The tank he had made was modified to have a chainsaw mounted to the top. Bill Zemanek, who was the photographer, was impressed with the robot despite the chainsaw not being functional. The article made it to the February 1994 edition of Wired magazine, written by Jeff Raskin, and it had this to say. Thorpe has launched a PR blitz for Robot Wars, inviting mad mechanics, technophiles, and movie special effects teams to build radio-controlled robots designed to rip, punch, and impale each other to scrap metal and frayed rubber while onlookers scream like ancient Romans at the Colosseum. Raskin also convinced Thorpe to make an email address to communicate to potential participants to the competition. Thorpe created robotwars@aol.com, and once the article had surfaced, thousands of emails, Thorpe recalls, started pouring in. I spent countless hours through the mail. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't doing anything but working on the event. Buzz was starting to finally be created, but Thorpe had one more obstacle at hand: sponsorship money. And the deposit date for the Fort Mason Center was nearing its deadline. In steps Gary Pinney, an executive at Smile Communications who were a division of an independent record label named Profile Records, based in New York and run by Steve Plotnicki. Originally, the contract was a joint venture partnership worth $50,000, and both would earn a 50% share each. This ended up changing to a limited liability corporation. Mark was absolutely delighted, and Gary Pinney seemed supportive of the venture. He could leave the financial responsibilities to other people and focus solely at the project at hand. Now that he had the exposure from the Wired article and the sponsorship money from Smile Records, the stage was set, and on the 20th of August 1994, the first ever Robot Wars competition took place.
Dr. Gabba, we have arrived at Goo Goo Lagoon.
The original competition had 3 weight classes: heavy, middle, and lightweight. Each class had 3 events: the face-off competition, 2 melee fights, one for the lightweight class and another for all classes to compete in, and an escort event, where competitors had to protect a remote-controlled drone from a house robot. This was the first time that the concept of a house robot would be used in any robot competition, and it would carry over to the UK television show and become one of the most recognisable parts of the show. The arena was 35 by 54 feet, with a pipe railing that stood 2 feet tall, supported by plywood, and had hazards like a net that would trap robots, and a swinging bowling ball, as well as pneumatically powered legs that would kick out at the robots. The tickets were $30 per person. Greg Munson, who would go on to be the co-creators of BattleBots, remembers the inaugural competition fondly. "It's crowded, I can't see what's going on, the bleachers are blocking my view, and I walk around the edge, and there's an opening. And I hear this mayhem and banging noises and smell this weird smell, and I turn the corner and boom! There's these little remote-controlled car robots with weapons thrashing into each other, smashing into each other, essentially killing each other." Despite this being only the first competition, it would be the debuts of robots that would in future be Robot Hall of Famers, like BattleBots classic Mauler, built by Charles Tilford, who at this point was called the South Bay Mauler, arguably the first full-body spinner in Robot Wars, and the Master, a robot with a circular saw mounted to the front of it, which won the Best Design Award in that year's competition. The Master was the brainchild of Mark Citrakian, who, like Mark Thorpe, was a former employee for Industrial Light and Magic at Lucasfilm. There were also some more novelty-type robots as well, like Andy Royd, who was a scary-looking puppet on a tricycle, who in its first battle, and additionally the first battle in Robot Wars history, got whacked in the head by the bowling ball.
Despite his rocket assist, the match ends in a draw.
What'd you think when it got hit in the head, though?
And Tiny Tim, a forklift robot which would be the inspiration for another Robot Combat Hall of Famer. But we'll get to them shortly. The winner of the heavyweight division ended up being a robot called Ramfire, who beat Tiny Tim in the first round and beat, pun intended, the Beetle, and became the first ever Robot Wars heavyweight champion. He'd also won the escort event too. In the lightweight competition, the winner was a robot called the Juliebot, who beat Slow-Mo, Pain Mower, and Andy Royd to the title. Juliebot was built by Will Wright, who was the founder of Maxis Software, responsible for titles like SimCity, The Sims, and Spore. And in the middleweight competition, although to call it a competition would not be entirely true, was won by X1, who beat the South Bay Mauler in the only battle in the competition. The final battle of the event was the melee.
Tiny Tim takes a whack at the X1 from Madison, but suddenly the Beetle rushes forward and disarms him. Meanwhile, the South Bay Mauler against the Housebot is David taking on Goliath. A crowd favorite from the lightweight class, Spiny Norman, has lost its spines and is soon crushed by the Housebot. A vengeful Tiny Tim cleans the hood ornament right off the Beetle. But wait, at the far end of the arena, the Mauler scores a major upset, prying an arm off the house robot. But the Housebot discovers it has an even more dreadful weapon now. After more than 10 minutes of remote-controlled mayhem, the South Bay Mauler, minus its maces, but one of only 2 competitors still running, is declared the winner of the inaugural Robot Wars.
Really what did it was the ability of this to get bashed, take a fair bit of deformation and damage, stay on its feet, and of our batteries not to run down. Good solid controller technology. We did not have an external antenna. We had an internal antenna.
Charles Tilford was given the grand prize for winning the melee, despite losing its only battle to X1. The event also had a demonstration performance by Survival Research Labs, a robotic-based performance group that would stage exhibitions using large-scale robotics. The following footage you're about to see is one of their pieces from 1988, titled A Bitter Message of Hopeless Grief. Mark Pauline demonstrated the running machine, which was so loud half of the audience ran out with their hands in their ears. He would then ridicule the competitors during the competition, and in a newspaper after the event called Robot Wars an SRL franchise. Additionally, he felt he was owed money by Joe Matheny for working on the arena, a spat that had to be ended by Gary Pinney saying he wasn't getting another check, which then led to him slating the event on the SRL website. Needless to say, he wasn't invited again for next year. Unfortunately, the event didn't make any money, but from a public point of view, the event was a massive success, selling to a crowd of 1,000 people, and its success spread through the internet and media. It even had a segment on the Discovery Channel which attracted even more people. The success of the event led to its continued existence with another competition a year later, August the 19th and 20th, once again at the Fort Mason Center, and to an audience nearly double it was last year. The scale of the competition was much larger too, having 49 participants instead of the previous year's 18. They hired a professional announcer, and a lot of competitors who had participated in last year's competition already had a whole year's worth of experience, making the standard of robots much better. Old favourites like the Master and South Bay Mauler were back, but other machines made their debut that competition, like La Machine, a fast, wedge-shaped robot that used its pushing power to immobilise and dismantle other robots. Created by none other than BattleBots co-creator Greg Munson. Blendo, a full-body spinner created by the future hosts of Mythbusters, Jamie Heineman and Adam Savage. The robot spinner was powered manually by a power jaw that Jamie inserted to start the internal combustion motor. The downside of that being, if it stopped, it couldn't be started again. And Thor, a robot built by Tyler Schilling and his cronies at Schilling Robotics, who were a company that specialised in hydronic mechanical arms for companies like NASA. Although he wasn't a participant, one of the people in the crowd during the 1995 event was none other than Carlo Bertaccini. But we'll get back to him soon. I promise. One thing that became very obvious for those at the 1995 heavyweight event was the impressiveness of Tyler Schilling's Thor. Although it struggled for control in its first fight against Merrimack, a robot with flippers on each side, it quickly became a mismatch for Thor and left a fair few holes in it. It used its big hydraulic hammer weapon to smash Cybernet into submission in the next round, making it all the way to the final. Blendo was another robot that caught the eye of many an audience member. Jamie Heineman had created an absolute beast when it came to the power it had. The initial motor that Heineman had thought of putting into the robot was capable of 20,000 revs per minute, which meant at the tip the robot could be capable of rotating up to speeds of Mach 5. But he had doubts, and after consulting a friend, he was told that anything going at that speed would immediately self-implode. So he set his sights back a little bit. 500 RPM felt like enough, and to Namreco 2000, 500 RPM was at least enough to warp the hardened steel spikes on it, which in 1995 was a lot of damage. This put Gary Pinney of Profile Records in an anxious state that was compounded further by the potential destruction of Blendo. If any debris had gotten into the crowd, the potential of lawsuits would be immediate. Gary had a safety inspector go to Heineman and Savage and told them to secure the bolts on their robots, which had come loose during that fight. The next fight would be with a robot named Dumore, and while Blendo won that fight, it was its eventual downfall. Blendo sent bits of debris from Dumore flying into the arena, one piece hitting a photographer and another narrowly missing a publicist who was 6 months pregnant at the time. Blendo hit the battery and made Dumore start smoking in the middle of the arena. Despite it still moving, it was obvious who had won the fight: the devastatingly powerful Blendo. Gary Pinney, however, was experiencing his own worst nightmare. He made his way to Mark Thorpe and demanded that Blendo was disqualified. Nobody had foreseen such a destructive robot at this competition, and while it wasn't Jamie Heineman's fault, he paid the biggest price for it. Pinney went up to the team and told them how they would react if they left the competition but got the prize money and the title of heavyweight co-champion. Jamie knew he really didn't have a choice in the matter, and gauged that he and Blendo were going to be disqualified. And that was the last of Blendo's participation in the 1995 US Robot Wars event. A $1,000 consolation prize for creating the best fighting robot anyone had ever seen up to that point. All that was left now was the main event of the day. The heavyweight final. Thor versus the Master. The special effects expert versus the NASA hydraulic arm providers. David against David again. Goku versus Vegeta. Superman versus Batman, etc., etc. The Master had made its way to the finale after disposing of Painful Wedgie and Mauler on its way to the final. What this audience wouldn't know is that they would witness one of the greatest battles in the history of robot combat. The battle begins, and within 15 seconds of the match starting, slam! Thor's hammer hits the Master's saw with a pinpoint accuracy and is immediately broken. The weapon, which had been so vital for the Master's success, was now nothing but a reminder of how powerful the hammer of Thor was. All it could do was try and use the lifting device, but that would be ultimately in vain, as Thor would just shake itself off. The Master starts to spin in ever-decreasing circles as Thor looked to be the victor. But then, as if the robotic gods started to smile upon him, the Master hit a lucky shot into the side of Thor. Its axe started to slump down as if it had died then and there. No movement from either robot for a good 10 seconds. And then, Thor's engine started to burn out. The robot that had been so destined to win this fight was suddenly on the back foot. The Master then got some power into the wheels and started pushing as the smoke got thicker and thicker. With no main weapon and an ultimately useless secondary weapon, the Master had done the unthinkable and won the match. The crowd went absolutely posse at the match that they had just seen. The Master, the comeback king, had become the 1995 US Robot Wars heavyweight champion. The final event of the competition, like last year, was the heavyweight melee, plus one middleweight. The champion of that competition, La Machine, a wedge-shaped robot built by Gage Coquois that used brute force to defeat opponents, and funnily enough, a robot that Marc Thorpe himself hated. He felt that the robot looked boring, plus he felt the name had pulled away from the wizardry behind the controls, and that it was merely just a simple robot. Nothing more, nothing less. I politely disagree, but that's not the point. The point is that La Machine made a mockery of its heavyweight counterparts and became the last robot standing in the melee. I can't find any footage, so you'll have to trust me on this. I swear, that's what the book says. Like the last one, the 1995 Robot Wars competition was a resounding success. The competition was fiercer, the once possible potential of robotic combat being a genuine sport was starting to be realised, and was starting to be heard outside of the States. In the UK, a TV director and producer named Tom Gutteridge was being shown a tape of the inaugural Robot Wars competition by a friend. While he had no technical experience, he absolutely loved the spectacle, and in March 1995 had been in talks with Gary Pinney and Steve Plotnicki of Profile Records to buy the rights of the standalone Robot Wars TV show to be aired in the UK. The venture was to be $5,000 for each episode produced, and before Marc Thorpe knew it, he was making a trip to London with the best robots from the US to film a Robot Wars TV pilot. Thorpe took with him Mark Satrakin with the Master, Tyler Schilling with Thor, and Trey Roski and Greg Munson with La Machine to represent the USA, while Derek Foxwell, Matt Irvine and Jean-Denis Lefebvre made their UK robotic counterparts. Sadly, not much footage has surfaced of this competition apart from highlights from the Robot Wars First Great War VHS tape. But what does exist is a great battle between the two American heavyweight giants that fought so valiantly in the 1995 US competition, Thor and the Master, in what is probably the first real grudge match in Robot Wars history. This time round, I will not be doing any commentary because the soothing tones of Dominic Diamond will put you right to sleep.
Yes, they are. Okay, they go for 30 seconds now. Here comes the sword, that's the first hit, and he's coming into it now. Oh, they're not to the deadly face. Oh, it's a skip. I thought that was so done for this.
Remember the
The
design.
Master would win that battle to meet La Machine in the final, and while sadly no footage of this exists, La Machine, like the melee before this, was the victor. More so now that the robot was a heavyweight and not a middleweight. The BBC executive seemed interested in the concept, but it wouldn't be for another 2 years till Robot Wars made its way to the air. This was because at the time, BBC controller Michael Jackson was on his way out of the job, and the director of programmes, Alan Yentob, was disinterested at the concept. So, in the wake of the 1995 UK Open event, came the 1996 event in August. If you thought 49 participants was big, this was astronomical. 83 participants would duke it out in respective weight categories, and the sport of robotic combat stood on its own 2 feet. By this point, just before the competition, we already had what we considered the best robots in the world, the likes of the Master, La Machine, and Thor. I would have included Blendo in there too, but they didn't participate that year because Savage and Heinemann were working on a film with Colossal Pictures. And in addition, the 6-foot plastic shielding was raised to 8 feet to alleviate any worries that Gary Pinney had during the last competitions. I would personally argue this competition to be the most important one in early US Robot Wars history, for a multitude of reasons. Like the previous year, the standard of robots was much, much higher. As well as the Master and La Machine and Mauler, there were new competitors that would stake their claim as some of the most iconic robots in the entire history of robotic combat. So here's a rundown of some of these robots. Vlad the Impaler would be considered one of the first genuinely effective lifting robots. Built by ex-La Machine member Gage Courtois, after thinking about Tiny Tim from the first US competition, he used that robot as inspiration for Vlad the Impaler. It had 2 long forklift devices at the front that would pick up opponents and turn them up and over for a knockout. Speaking of effective lifting robots, remember Carlo Bertoncini, the guy in the stands during the 1995 event? Well, he's made a robot too, and it's an absolute doozy. Biohazard had a lifting arm that would pick up opponents and flip them up and over too. Taz was another lifting robot, but in a more unconventional manner. It had a rod that could rotate 360 degrees at a top speed of 6 miles an hour. With all these new incredible robots ready to fight for the title of Robot Wars Heavyweight Champion, the 1996 Robot Wars competition was underway. One of the first battles to happen in the competition was Taz versus battle-hardened veterans The Master, after both were given a bye. But as Robot Wars usually does, and as The Master caused an upset win against Thor in the 95 competition, Taz caused an upset win and defeated the reigning face-off champions after the saw broke down and Taz pinned it for 30 seconds. Meanwhile, in the actual first round, Biohazard went up against Robot Redford Jr. and demonstrated its awesome power almost straight away, flipping it over and pinning it against the arena sidewall, and in the next round, made even lighter work of Terminal Frenzy. Vlad the Impaler, while it didn't use its lifter, made easy work of Prometheus on its way to the next round, and La Machine absolutely obliterated Mauler with ease. The weight increase really playing to La Machine's advantage. Now that the robots were all on the same wavelength, the quarterfinals were underway. La Machine versus Taz. And like you would expect, La Machine made light work of Taz, going as far as to knock the dome off the top of Taz. It was flipped over, and it was over before it even started. Rex, a robot that looked straight out of an SRL exhibition, withdrew for reasons not even specified, which conveniently made the knockout stages even, instead of having 5 quarterfinal matches, which would technically make it a 5th final. I don't know, early Robot Wars is weird. Next to fight was Killboard versus Biohazard. Killboard was a robot with 2 pneumatic spikes and tracks that were strong enough to move around with a person pushing it. Too bad it was ultimately useless against the unstoppable Biohazard, being flipped over onto its back like a turtle, and before we knew it, Biohazard were in the semi-finals. The next battle was Dumore versus Merrimack. As far as I'm aware, although I'm probably not doing the best job finding out, there's no footage of this battle, but the winner was Dumore. Trust me, you know, that's what the website says. Vlad the Impaler made absolute light work of Punjai in its fight, and according to the announcer was probably the quickest fight in the whole competition. Seriously, that's what he sounded like. Not surprising considering the effectiveness of lifting weapons in this year's robots. Next up, the semi-finals. The rise of the robots with a lack of any colour other than silver. Our 4 semi-finalists, Dumore, Vlad the Impaler, Biohazard, and La Machine represented the new class of robots. Let the semi-finals begin! Our first battle is Biohazard versus Vlad the Impaler, the 2 most effective lifting robots of the competition, assigned to fight in the semi-finals.
Roboteers, stand by. 3, 2, 1. Activate.
The battle starts and Vlad manages to snag Biohazard in between its forks, lifting the robot in the air. Biohazard tries to use its lifting arm to pull away, which doesn't initially work, but after a moment of struggling, manages to get back on the ground. Biohazard tries for an attack and misses. Vlad has the higher ground clearance and is more susceptible to a flip if it's put in this situation. Biohazard goes for an attack, but it comes to naught. Vlad scampers away at breakneck pace. Then, Biohazard sees a weak spot and goes on the attack once again, lifts it high up in the air and lands on top of Biohazard. It's now stuck on Biohazard's arm. They're temporarily stuck in a stalemate. A quick tangent. One of the ways to knock out an opponent is to impale it, similar to wrestling, so Biohazard had to move to keep the battle going. But Biohazard shakes off Vlad and the battle continues. And then, as quick as a flash, Vlad goes on the attack and flips Biohazard up and over. It's done! Vlad has surely won this match. Until something historic happens. Biohazard becomes the first robot in the history of the sport to use its weapon to self-right itself. This would become known as a Shreemech in future incarnations of Robot Wars, short for self-righting mechanism. The battle is decided as a crowd decision, and as they had never seen a Shreemech being used in battle before, the match was given to Biohazard. Don't you just love the early days of Robot Wars where self-righting could give you the match win? I certainly do. Next to fight was La Machine versus Dumore. While not as exciting as the previous bout, La Machine showed that he was one to beat, as Dumore was beaten to a pulp and left upside down on one of the mousetraps on the arena wall. That left only 2 robots. Carla Bertoncini's self-righting monster, Biohazard, and Trey Roski and Greg Munson's La Machine, a once middleweight robot that could beat the heavyweights, now a heavyweight, and doing the exact same thing. They were so sure that they were going to win that they were already doing interviews for overseas TV outlets.
3, 2, 1. Activate.
The battle starts, and almost immediately, Biohazard tries to flip La Machine over, but fails to do so. Biohazard tries again, but fails in its second attempt. But suddenly, La Machine is stuck. A piece of the robot falling off and immobilizing it. The battery box was exposed. The battle was over. Just like that. Biohazard didn't even need to flip it over. Biohazard was the 1996 Robot Wars heavyweight champion. Greg Munson would later say that he and Roski were caught up in the frenzy and ended up being way overconfident before their battle with Biohazard. Bertoncini had apparently even said to Roski after the fight, "I never lose," throwing back to what Roski and Munson had been dealing before the final started. However, in a bit of great sportsmanship, other roboteers came and helped rebuild La Machine in time for the melee, showing the incredible sportsmanship that Robot Wars is capable of producing. And funnily enough, they won, and Roski said to Bertoncini back, "We all lose sometime." The winners of the other weight classes, from super light to middleweight, were as follows. In the super light, it was X2, in the light, it was Lorena 2, and in the middleweight, it was the Agamemnon. Biohazard won 2 awards in the prize giving, winning Best Design and Best Engineered Robots, while Spunky Monkey won the Strangest Robot Award, and Gladiator Rodney won the Autonomous Award. All in all, another resounding success. However, this would be where the fun and the action starts to divert into a really ugly situation. One that would change the direction of Robot Wars and robotic combat as a sport forever. If you're in a rut thanks to the letters of the laws, just be thankful you didn't start Robot Wars. See you next time.
Hello there, suddenly I have shit microphone quality because I can't be asked to set the microphone up, but that's okay. Hey, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you like it, make sure you subscribe, and tell your friends about it. If they like UK nostalgia as much as I do, then yeah, share it to them. And hopefully this series will be more fleshed out as the year comes along. This is a New Year's resolution to myself. I'm going to make a full-on Robot Wars style documentary, because this is a show that I love, this is a community that I love, and this is something that I've wanted to really properly dip my toes in. And I had done a couple of years ago, but this is the very first time I did something very long form. And hopefully you guys enjoy it, and hopefully you guys stay along for the ride. So, a little carbonation, and I'll see you next time.